Last year, in December, I reported on the case of Australian priest Father Michael Rowe. He's from the Archdiocese of Perth, Australia. A truly beautiful place if you've ever actually visited. I have about 10 or 12 years ago at this point. Father Rowe is a priest dedicated to tradition. And I'm going to have to revisit his story today because we got an update on it after I last reported on it in early January. And it's an unfortunate update because he has been stripped of all of his faculties for associating with groups that the new religion doesn't particularly like, and headed by a bishop who has said some unfortunate things, but which has helped smear anybody associated with them. And as a consequence, a local bishop has attempted to make Father Rowe persona non grata in his own diocese. It wasn't all that long ago, only about 5 years ago, that Father Rowe was celebrated publicly by the Archdiocese of Perth for his silver jubilee. That'd be the 25th anniversary of his ordination. And I'll just give you an idea of the kind of standing he had here before he was essentially canceled. So we go to the perthcatholic.org.au website for this, which is, again, this is the official newspaper of the Diocese of Perth. With the headline, 25 Years of Living the Call to Save Souls. Father Rowe celebrates his silver jubilee. Now, I'm starting here because I want you to actually understand the kind of priest we're talking about here. This is the kind of priest we need more of in the church. So this is just a short excerpt from this because it'll show you that his life has been centered on our blessed Lord and the salvation of souls. Again, kind of priests we need. So here's a brief excerpt to give you an idea of his personal story before everything fell apart for him. Quote, born in Perth, Father Rowe shared that his discovery of Christ came about partly through his upbringing. Both my parents passed away when I was a baby, so I was brought up by my grandmother, he explained. This led to a lot of thinking about my place in the world, why we're here in the world, and the meaning of life. It was in the silence of just going to Mass on my own that I realized there was someone who cared for me and loved me. The things that happen to us affect us in life, and often in those sad things, that's where we find God, he said. As a young man, Father Rowe had won a scholarship in metallurgy, an art and science of metallic elements, but discerned that he was being called in a different direction. I decided it wasn't for me and kept thinking that there's so much more to life than material things and the things of this world. So it was that focus on the next world and the spiritual realm that led me down this path. Because St. Charles Seminary was closed at the time, Father Rowe spent 7 years in Adelaide at Rostrevor's St. Francis Xavier Seminary before returning to Perth to be ordained to the priesthood by then Archbishop of Perth Barry Hickey on May 21st, 1994, on the Vigil of Pentecost. 25 years later, Father Rowe said there have been many highlights which have stood out for him. I would say encountering Christ in the sacraments and helping people along in the sacraments and walking together with them have been highlights, whether baptisms, weddings, or funerals, he said. The priest is often involved in both the happy and the sad times, so there are always lots of occasions to remember over the years. Those events have stood out for me over my time in the priesthood. End kind of lengthy quote. See, Father Rowe has dedicated himself to the traditional Mass and to the traditional form of the sacraments. And it is that reason that he is being canceled by, or he was initially canceled, and the first time he was canceled by his bishop. You see, he did not particularly care for Traditionis Custodes and the rather dubious logic behind that document. Give me a second here. I'm having a minor little technical issue on my end, so I'm just going to take care of it while we queue up the article here about what happened to him. You see, what happened in the past was that Father Rowe was, like a lot of traditional priests, subject to an unjust decree from Rome about the traditional sacraments. And this got published. His resistance to this, because he chose to resist, made the national news in Australia. And then from there, his battle with the diocese for not complying made international news. That's how we found out about it here. And all of this is to give you an update, to lead to the update on what happened to him. So the headline here from from the West Australian is Church of St. Anne Belmont priest Father Michael Rowe sacked by Archbishop Tim Costello over his Latin Mass. See, things came to a head when Traditionis Custodes was issued. There were so many priests canceled, we couldn't cover all of them here. A lot of bishops tried to resist. They tried invoking canon law to resist. Others just quietly pretended it didn't happen. And the Vatican came down like the wrath of God on them. And in this article, you're going to see a really nasty accusation leveled against the priest. And they essentially claim he tried to steal from his own parish. Now, at the time, Father Rowe said, and I reported on it at the time, that the only things he took from the parish when he left that parish to go start offering masses in the traditional form independently of the diocese, the only things he took were his personal belongings, including things that he purchased that were mass implements that he purchased with his own money. And they tried to smear him because there has been an ongoing effort for any priest to resist the evil dictates from Rome to turn them into essentially pariahs, to push them to the margins of the church's society. And keep all this in mind as you hear this little context from this secular Australian outlet, because Catholicism isn't exactly the most popular thing in Australia with the authorities. Go look what happened to Cardinal Pell, to the great lengths the state went to before finally their highest court said, this whole case stinks. It's obviously fake. And they dismissed the charges against him after he'd already been in jail for a crime he did not commit. From the article, quote, "A priest who defied the Catholic Archbishop Tim Costello by practicing the Latin Mass has been sacked, had his bank accounts frozen, and is being investigated over concerns he stole from his own church. Father Michael Rowe was removed as rector of the Church of St. Anne shortly before Christmas. His sacking, which came after he refused to obey an order about how Mass was delivered, resulted in a screaming argument between rival parishioners on the steps of the Belmont Church. The veteran priest had built a big congregation of West Australians who enjoyed the tradition of the Latin Mass, which is being phased out by papal decree. Priests who wish to deliver the Mass in Latin, we'll put an asterisk here, people who are not Catholic do not know, in fact, sadly, a lot of Catholics don't know, that there are massive differences between the traditional Mass and the Novus Ordo being said in Latin. Clearly, they think this is just a matter of the language, when the Novus Ordo and the traditional Latin Mass are extremely different in not just the language, but also in the form of the Mass. Check out the New Liturgical Movement website if you want to go dive down that rabbit hole, but it's something people should know the difference of. Anyway, said they describe it as an ancient style most recently endorsed in 1962, and that you need special permission to offer it. And then quoting the bishop, "Your failure to seek authorization to celebrate the Mass using the Roman Missal of 1962 at the Church of St. Anne Belmont is a violation of the obligation you freely undertook when you were ordained a deacon," Archbishop Costello said in a letter dated December 11th. "I have determined that your appointments, in light of the Holy Father's motu proprio, are no longer appropriate. Therefore, I hereby formally advise you that your appointment as the rector of the Church of St. Anne Belmont and as a spiritual leader of the community that gathers there to celebrate the Mass using the Roman Missal promulgated by St. John the 23rd in 1962 are hereby revoked with immediate effect." In a letter sent to the parishioners, Father Rowe accused the Archdiocese of freezing his parish's bank accounts. "All access to the Catholic Development Fund bank accounts for the community and music accounts have been cut off for me to access in the normal manner," he wrote. End quote. Hence why he went independent. It's not that hard to figure out what happened here, right? That's his reasoning. And he issued a full letter also. I read the full letter a few months ago, and I'm not going to do that here again. I just want you to hear the case he's making here before I go to the update. So because his letter is really long, it's like 7 pages in length, but I'm going to skip down to near the end where he talks about Traditionis Custodes, because the new religion cannot handle the pre-conciliar forms of the sacraments or anything, because if they're trying to replace Catholicism, you can't have Catholicism still existing within the structure of the ape of the church. So you have to get rid of all the trappings of Catholicism, and including its worship, which is not a trapping in the slightest. But remember, how we worship is the law of what we believe. Okay. And they are instituting new forms of the Mass as we speak. We've talked about that extensively in recent days, including they're now Mayan enculturated Mass for whatever reason. But here is the impact of Traditionis Custodes and why he's resisting. He says, quote, during the protracted legal battle, Traditionis Custodes was released. Although while the matter was before the civil courts, the archbishop was not quick to seek to enforce it. Once the legal battle was over and the decisive victory was the archbishop's, he then sought to enact a decree implementing the motu proprio. A copy of that decree can be found on the Archdiocese of Perth's website and is referred to in the Archbishop's recent open letter to the people who worship at St. Anne's. The decree was heavily restrictive and required all priests to apply for permission to say the Latin Mass pursuant to Article 5 of Traditionis Custodes. Conditional to such approval being considered, not even necessarily granted, but merely considered by the Archbishop, I was provided a document typed up by the Archbishop's delegate, Monsignor Michael Keating, requiring me to sign a declaration attesting to the following. Here's your loyalty oath that he had to say, that he had to actually adhere to. 1. That, quote, I do not deny the validity and the legitimacy of the liturgical reform dictated by Vatican Council II and the magisterium of the Supreme Pontiffs. Now, Vatican II didn't actually call for a liturgical reform. It didn't call for a new Mass. It didn't. Go read the documents. 2. That I accept the legitimacy of the concelebration of the Eucharist that appropriately expresses the unity of the priesthood, of the sacrifice, and also of the whole people of God. By the way, I found where the phrase people of God come from, and when you hear it, you will never want to use it again. Spoiler for a future video, it comes from actual condemned heretics. It does. Future video, though. 3. That I acknowledge that the liturgical books promulgated by St. Paul VI and St. John Paul II in conformity with the decrees of Vatican Council II are the unique expression of the Lex Orandi, the Roman Rite, meaning the traditional Mass of 16, 18 centuries is no longer valid, essentially. 4. That I acknowledge the identity and unitary expression in the Roman Rite is found in all the liturgical books promulgated by the authority of the Supreme Pontiff. 5. That I shall maintain the observance of all the laws in the Code of Canon Law regulating the sacred liturgy, and in particular the laws promulgated by Pope Francis in his motu proprio. 6. That having been granted the authorization to celebrate Mass using the Roman Missal approved in 1962 by Pope John XXIII, I shall use this Missal to the exclusion of any other Missal approved for use prior to the year 1962. That means that he cannot do the pre-1955 Holy Week. That's what that means. For those who don't know, the same people who gave us the new Mass in 1954 sat down with with Pope Pius XII with his authority and changed completely the Holy Week liturgy. Completely changed it, and that's considered one of the great tragedies of liturgical history that opened the door completely for the liturgical innovations and revolution that happened after Vatican II. And again, read the documents of Vatican II. They do not call for a new Mass. They call for essentially offering the traditional Latin Mass with the Our Father and maybe the Creed in the vernacular, and maybe the chanting of the readings in the vernacular, and that's about it. That's what they call for. If that had happened, if that's the reform we got, there would probably not be a traditionalist movement today. Full stop, because that's not what happened. But here's what he says. And finally, he says, I have serious problems with some of the above propositions which simply contain factual errors or attempt to assert things that I simply do not believe are true. I cannot in good conscience sign such a document with the above propositions because I do not believe they reflect the truth of Catholic doctrine and dogma as passed down in the Church throughout history. Just because the Holy Father and the Archbishop of Perth believe these statements to be true does not necessarily of itself make them true. Such statements have to be carefully considered in the light of continuity of Catholic tradition. Rather than reflecting the truth of Catholic doctrine and dogma as passed down in the Church throughout history, my concern with these statements is that they represent a rupturing from such truth and tradition. End quote. Again, hermeneutic continuity went out the window with Francis. It did. They even admitted as much. Now, after this letter, he would go on to offer the Mass at a local independent chapel. And that was basically the story for all of 2024. We didn't hear anything else after that. Until this suddenly hit the news in late September, and then just a couple of days ago again. See, in late September, the diocese issued a statement that was a veiled snub at the now independent priest, saying that all Masses are public and issuing norms that he could not follow in good conscience. Okay, so this was again them attempting to double down on the logic of Traditionis Custodes, and so the priest issued a response to that. And I would give you what the statement the bishop said, but in something I'll give to you here in a moment that was after this that the bishop said, he has a link to his original statement that's not there. You go there and it just takes you to the front page of the Diocese of Perth's website, which is unfortunate. And if the bishop would actually post it publicly where it's easy to see and easy to find, I would bring that to you because his statement also is important and should be here on the record. But here is Father Rowe's response as posted by the YouTube channel TLM Perth. Statement in response to Archbishop's statement dated 20th September. I have been made aware that the Archbishop Costello put out a statement dated 20th September entitled Clarification Regarding Matters Concerning the Public Celebration of the Liturgy in the Archdiocese of Perth. The statement was made available to all the faithful at St. Anne's Church, Belmont, where I was formerly rector, on Sunday, September 22nd, 2024. And it was sent by email to all clergy of the Archdiocese of Perth on Monday, the 23rd of September. I note that this statement simply notes a series of purported facts that the Archdiocese alleges about me. It is clear from that statement that all that was being expressed is the Archdiocese version of events and opinion about recent matters. The problem with the Archbishop's statement is that it is littered with factual inaccuracies. It contains errors of fact, and from those errors it appears to lead the reader to draw erroneous conclusions about myself and those who choose to come to Mass at what the Archbishop describes as the Latvian Center in Belmont. I note that I have always maintained and emphasized often that the Masses I offer at the Latvian Center are private Masses, not public Masses. I have at no stage advertised these Masses broadly, and the first person to advertise the existence of these Masses broadly and publicize them and their location is Archbishop Costello in his statement dated 20th September 2024. Despite the heading of the Archbishop's statement referring to public celebration of the liturgy, I repeat that these are private Masses on private property, not in a public church, chapel, or oratory of the Archdiocese of Perth, that I have never advertised to the public. They are by specific invitation only. Archbishop Costello's statement not only contains factual errors, but it is a slanderous act of defamation of my good name and good reputation. Despite the Archbishop's statement, it is important to note that I remain a priest of canonical good standing within the Archdiocese of Perth. The Archdiocese recently confirmed this in writing to me, and I have the same faculties in place that every other priest in the good standing in the Archdiocese of Perth currently enjoys. The Archbishop's statement does not contradict or change that position. Anyone who has any concerns about the Archbishop's statement is welcome to make a time to come and see me and discuss these concerns with me. Signed, Father Michael Rowe. Well, as you might imagine, that changed immediately. The bishop did not particularly like such a statement, and so he published this on the Perth Catholic website, dated Sunday, October 13th, this past Sunday of this year. Again, and they keep referring to the Latvian Center, and you're going to see what part of this is. And so this is where I'm going to have to define for you what the SSPX resistance are. So you know that in the late 60s and early 70s, Archbishop Lefebvre essentially retired after serving Pope Pius XII directly and serving at the Second Vatican Council and everything else. He decided to retire. He was eventually approached by a group of seminarians who bluntly told him they weren't getting Catholicism at the seminaries anymore. They were getting something else. And they asked him to start a seminary, and he relented and had permission from bishops in Switzerland to found a seminary in Icone, Switzerland. Thus, the SSPX was founded, basically. There was a whole bunch of other things that happened. But one of the things that ended up happening was the SSPX got into the debates with the Vatican about doctrine and dogma and the things that happened at Vatican II. And they got the runaround even from Ratzinger and others. That's just a fact of history, which is why after the world watched the nefarious events at Assisi in 1986, Lefebvre's attitude about things changed a lot because he had been trying to get a bishop for the SSPX for some time, got the runaround, got a lot of wishy-washy statements from the Vatican. And after Assisi, well, at that point, it was time for the rubber to meet the road. He consecrated 4 bishops in 1988, which then caused kind of a bit of a split in the SSPX. A group of priests left them to go found the FSSP because they couldn't quite go along with those bishops. Archbishop Lefebvre went and, well, he passed away in the 1990s. And the new leadership of the SSPX at that time started having their dialogue sessions with the Vatican. And some criticized within the SSPX that they were getting essentially too cozy with Rome, saying, going from like Archbishop Lefebvre saying like 80% of Vatican II was okay, and it was that other 20% that were just non-starters, and some of them being blatant heresies, to them moving that needle to 85 to 90%, and getting a little too nice with Rome, getting a little too nice with some of the bishops. And so Bishop Williamson, one of the 4 bishops consecrated by Archbishop Lefebvre, said some pretty ill-advised things about certain events in the 1940s, and eventually found himself in hot water with the SSPX, and he got the boot. And then he consecrated some bishops without permission and incurred automatic excommunication like Archbishop Lefebvre did. Now, I don't think the one that involved Archbishop Lefebvre was valid either, was valid in itself. And unless you can give me a good reason why Bishop Williamson incurred automatic excommunication, when I don't think Archbishop Lefebvre actually did, I view his automatic excommunication with a gigantic grain of salt also. That's not to say I endorse the things he said that got him in trouble. But he ended up founding something called the Marian Corps, also called the SSPX Resistance. The highest profile SSPX Resistance priest that I'm aware of is Father Paul Kramer, who wrote a magnificent book on Fatima, is very public, was on Facebook. You might be friends with him, for all you know. Father Michael Rowe had some association in what looks like a support association with the SSPX Resistance. At least that's what's being alleged here. And that's what's going on here. That's what you're seeing referred to here. So here is the response to Father Michael Rowe's statement. On 20th September 2024, I, the bishop, issued a statement providing clarification regarding matters concerning the public celebration of the liturgy in the Archdiocese of Perth. This statement is publicly available on the website of the Archdiocese of Perth. Well, he says it is. I could not find it. In response, Father Rowe published a public statement which he wrote, quote, "I have always maintained and emphasized often that the masses I offer at the Latvian Center are private masses, not public masses. And I have at no stage advertised these masses broadly. They're private masses on private property, not in a public church, chapel, or oratory that I have never advertised to the public. They are by special invitation only. It is the teaching of the Church, the sacred liturgy, that is the celebration of the Mass and the administration of the sacraments is the public worship of the Church. Strictly speaking, by the way, that's true. However, these liturgical celebrations are not private actions, but celebrations of the Church itself as the sacrament of unity. That is the holy people united and organized under the bishops. Celebration of the Mass is an action of Christ himself and of the Church. The statements of Father Rowe that the Masses he celebrates at the Latvian Center are, quote, private Masses misrepresents the Church's teaching. Let's pause here. This is the kind of statement made by that you would expect the kind of mental gymnastics to justify coming down hard on someone that you would expect from a public politician who is waxing eloquently about how we should all be unburdened by what has been. Okay, that's the kind of statement we're talking about here. This is mental gymnastics. Priests offer private masses all the time. A priest on his day off from doing parish work is still required to offer mass. That's a private mass unless they invite somebody to do it. It's very obvious that Father Michael Rowe, when he said a public mass, he meant one that was on a schedule somewhere that you could just walk in the door to as a layman and attend. A priest doesn't tell you about the mass he offers in his side chapel in his rectory on a Monday morning on the day a priest typically has off, quote unquote. Let's continue though. Notwithstanding Father Rowe's statement that these masses are not in a church, chapel, or oratory, in both the September and October 2024 notices distributed to the community which gathers at the Latvian Center, the area where mass is celebrated is referred to as St. George Oratory. Referring to that area as an oratory is not a true statement because Father Rowe has not sought or obtained from me the permission required by the law of the Church for that location to be used exclusively for divine worship by the community that he gathers there for the celebration of Mass. My statement of 20th September 2024 was occasioned by the fact that Bishop Bellini celebrated Mass on 15th September 2024 and subsequently administered the sacrament of confirmation at the Latvian Center. Bishop Bellini belongs to the organization known as the SSPX Resistance, which does not possess any legal status in the church, and therefore Bishop Bellini does not legitimately exercise any ministry in the church. Moreover, Bishop Bellini incurred automatically the ecclesial penalty of excommunication when he was consecrated by Bishop Williamson, the founder of SSPX Resistance, without the authorization of the Pope. As a person who has incurred the penalty of excommunication, Bishop Bellini is prohibited from celebrating the sacrifice of the Eucharist and other sacraments, and from receiving the sacraments as stated in the law of the Church. Two other priests have come to the Archdiocese of Perth for the celebration of the Sacred Liturgy. One is Father Nicholas Rinn, a priest incarnated in the Archdiocese of Sydney. The other is Father Luke Macaretis, a priest illegitimately ordained by Bishop Williamson of the SSPX Resistance, who does not belong to any diocese in Australia and does not exercise legitimately any ministry in the church. Neither priest has been authorized by me to celebrate Mass according to any missal antecedent to the reform of the Sacred Liturgy of 1970. And it goes on and on like this, including Father Rowe then rejecting essentially all the things we talked about earlier. And then it goes to this. It says, priests are required to have the faculties of the Archdiocese of Perth, whereby they are authorized to exercise the priestly ministry in the name of the Church for the benefit of Christ's faithful and the good of the community. Father Rowe's insistence in refusing to comply with my lawful instruction to cease celebrating the Mass using the Roman Missal promulgated by John the 23rd in 1962 within the Archdiocese of Perth has occasioned the revocation of Father Rowe's archdiocesan faculties. Therefore, as of 12 a.m. on the 14th day of October, all the faculties granted to Father Rowe will be revoked. Accordingly, Mass is no longer to be celebrated at the Latvian Center. For Christ's faithful of the Archdiocese of Perth who wish to attend Mass celebrated using the Roman Missal approved by John the 23rd in 1962, the Mass is authorized to be celebrated at the Church of St. Anne Belmont, and the Chapel of the Good Shepherd at Kelmscott will continue to be celebrated for you. So he then revoked all of his faculties for his being associated with Bishop Williamson, essentially. And that is what's going on here. And there will be more. There will be more. But for some clarity on this, I want to turn here to something Cardinal Burke has said. Or not Cardinal Burke, Cardinal Mueller. Because there are people in the church who simply cannot read the signs of what's going on in the church. See, Cardinal Mueller had some words to say that were generally unrelated to this. He said so in a not English language interview that you can, if you want to, go watch on YouTube. But this was reported in Info Catholica. Cardinal Mueller has been an outspoken critic of the Synod on Synodality. He has recently given interviews on the subject of the Synod on Synodality. For those who are wondering what he's been saying about the current synod, he has been out of the current synod until just recently coming into it because he has not been well. And I think you can sum up everything that we talk about on this channel and how some people don't get it with this headline, which comes through us from Info Catholica. Mueller, anyone who does not see the current confusion is blind. Cardinal Gerhard Mueller has stressed the importance of perseverance in faith in an interview with Riccardo Cassioli, director of La Bussolia Quotidiana. At a time of doctrinal uncertainty in the Church, the Cardinal laments the growing confusion and warns the danger of falling into relativism, stating that the only sure guide is to remain faithful to Christ and to Catholic doctrine. That is our duty in such times. Whether it's a priest being canceled for, strictly speaking, adhering to the traditional forms of worship and the sacraments in the church, and even if that means they have to make associations for basic support a priest needs from a bishop by going to and allying themselves with bishops who have no, quote, canonical standing, or if it's the laity having to take on some rather unsavory opinions about the state of the church, there are signs of the times in the church that tell us how bad things are, and some of us are not willing to accept them. This time, we all open our eyes to what is going on, and that is Cardinal Mueller's general challenge here. Let's go over this article. It says, quote, in an extensive interview given by Cardinal Gerhard Mueller to Riccardo Cassioli with the framework of the meetings of La Bussolia Quotidiana, the prelate addresses fundamental themes that affect the church today, placing special emphasis on the need to persevere in faith despite times of confusion. Mueller, who has been prefect for the Congregation of the Doctrine of the Faith, expresses his concern about the doctrinal ambiguity that has taken hold in some sectors of the church. Referring to the Gospel of St. Matthew, which mentions the appearance of false prophets and the cooling of love, Mueller notes, quote, this passage seems to accurately describe what we are experiencing today. We see confusion arising and many losing their fervor in the faith, but the Lord tells us clearly that whoever perseveres to the end will be saved. The Cardinal recalls that perseverance is not something that the faithful can achieve on their own, but is a gift from God. We can do nothing without God's grace. It is He who gives us the strength to go on, especially when trials and temptations overwhelm us. In this sense, Mueller stresses that perseverance is key to overcoming the disappointment and discouragement that can arise, both from one's own difficulties and from the weaknesses of others within the Christian community. End quote. We will return to that in a moment. The key there is perseverance, including in the face of the institutional hierarchy of the church turning against you. This is all he's saying this with the backdrop of the Synod on Synodality, which is it has the goal of turning the church on its own head. There is open talk now of eliminating the hierarchical structure of the church and replacing it with something new, reducing the Pope and bishops to figureheads who are at the service of the laity. And I don't mean at the service of the laity in the way that we talk about how shepherds are servants. Not in that way, but putting the laity in charge of things. They're openly talking about this now at the Synod. Now, I don't think Francis will quite go as far as they want with it, but how far they'll go, who knows? There are signs that we need to see, and it takes sometimes drastic actions for us to do the most basic thing we're called to do as Catholics: preserve the faith, to keep the faith, to not just go along and in the process lose our souls because some heretic and with a mitre decided that they knew better than Christ and the Holy Spirit. But there are some things here, more things here worth checking in with Cardinal Mueller on. So talks about here the doctrinal confusion and ambiguity and how it's used to undermine the faith of the believers. Quote, during the interview, the prefect emeritus of doctrine for the faith addresses the growing doctrinal confusion within the church, which he describes as a real threat to the unity of the faithful. He recalls the words of the late Cardinal Carlo Caffarra, who had already warned that, quote, anyone who does not see the current confusion is blind. Cardinal Mueller criticizes the lack of clarity on some fundamental aspects of doctrine, pointing out that there are those who seem to want to build a church to, quote, suit their own desires, which leads to a dangerous drift of faith. That's him invoking the ape of the church, essentially, saying that that's what they're doing. In particular, he refers to the tensions that have arisen around the figure of the Pope and the contradictory interpretations of his magisterium. Mueller indicates that although the figure of the Pope is central to the church, it should not be confused with the institution of the papacy as a whole. It is essential to distinguish between the papacy and Pope as an individual. Popes are different people with their own strengths and weaknesses, and they are not exempt from errors in their human dimensions. The Cardinal explains that the Pope's mission, as Christ has entrusted it to Peter, is to confirm the faithful in the faith, but he assures that no Pope should act in a completely autonomous manner, but rather needs to have good advisors to help him discern the best decisions for the Church. In this regard, he underlies the importance of balance between the Pope and College of Cardinals, as well as the value of ecclesiastical institutions, such as the Synod of Bishops, to guarantee that unity and fidelity to doctrine are maintained. As for the faithful who just feel disoriented by the lack of doctrinal clarity, Mueller encourages them to seek comfort and strength in the Word of God, in the tradition of the Church, and in the teaching of the great theologians and fathers of the Church. It is necessary to read and study the Bible, the Catechism, and the great documents of the Magisterium. It is also essential to turn to the work of renowned theologians, such as St. Augustine, St. Thomas Aquinas, and St. John Henry Newman. He also calls on the faithful to pray for their pastors, to support bishops and priests who strive to be firm guides in the faith. He acknowledges that in the history of the church, there have been times when even the majority of bishops have not been up to the challenge, such as in the times of the Arian heresy, but he assures that the truth will always prevail. End quote. And then he goes on and reminds people of something that everybody needs to hear. Catholicism is not a political project. Certainly, there are political implications to our faith. Absolutely. But the idea of addressing the world's political problems with the church is weird. And that's what you see Francis doing. That's what you see the participants of the synod doing when they bring up how the James Martin crowd are treated by the world, or how the ladies are treated by the world, and then how the church needs to do something about that. Well, and usually the doing something about that is by conforming to what the world is doing. That's what they want, right? The political project here is to adopt the values of the world, and that is being condemned, as it should be. That is not what the church is about. And that is the underlying thinking of Traditionis Custodes. Because remember what I told you at the beginning of this. You cannot have the new religion with the worship of the old. You can't. And so they are trying to finally do away with it. I'm curious what you have to say about this in the comments. So let me know what you have to say, and hit like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. As does sharing this on social media. That helps too. If you ever thought about supporting Return to Tradition on Patreon or whatever, that would be really helpful in this day and age. It does help keep these messages coming. And now we turn to the live chat before I wrap this up. You said, Traditional Catholic says, I simply act Catholic in conformity with the faith. Right. Just live to what the church actually has always taught. Mudson says, God bless Mueller, but like Strickland and Burke, they still approve the new Mass and Vatican II overall. There are different stages of awakening, but are not traditional. Right. These are, well, again, you will be hard-pressed to find any truly traditional bishops outside of the SSPX and adjacent organizations. You'll be very hard-pressed to find them, because if they are citing the hermeneutic of continuity, if they're citing Vatican II documents in a positive way, for the most part, you start to get into really dicey ground. Okay, folks. Edu says, Mueller seems like he has his head screwed on straight. Right, that's why I keep bringing him into videos like this, because he usually has things to say that are of value to the state of the church today, to everything we are dealing with in our time. Any final thoughts? All right, folks. Thanks very much today for tuning in. And like I said, as always, pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.